Hello, everybody, and welcome to Presence. I am Doug King, and I am delighted to be here today with Dr. Jude Currivan. I'm going to get into her bio in just one second, but first, let me just welcome you, Jude. Thank you so much for taking time to join us today.
It's my great pleasure, Doug, and I'm joining you from a quite grey day in England.
Well, we've had a lot of rain here. We're in Atlanta on the eastern side of the States, and today is a sunny day. So that tells us that there's diversity in the world.
Indeed, there is. I'm really happy to be with you.
Now, I'm going to do a selective bio of Jude's background. And as I said to her just a minute ago, it's got to be selective because I would take the whole episode up if I gave you all of her bio. And so let me just give you a brief overview of what she's done. Jude would be described as a cosmologist, a planetary healer, a futurist, author. And previously, what really fascinated me was that Jude was one of the most senior businesswomen in the UK, business near and dear to my past. She is founder of co-founder rather of Whole Worldview. Jude has traveled to more than 80 countries around the world. That tells you a lot about her content and its importance. She does a great job of integrating leading edge science, research into consciousness, as well as universal wisdom teachings, combined into a holistic worldview. This is so beautiful about our all in all understanding. All of that underpins her work aimed at enabling transformational and emergent resolutions to our collective planetary issues, raising awareness, empowering fundamental change, and sustainable solutions to global problems. Jude holds a PhD in archaeology from University of Reading in the UK. She, in that, researched ancient cosmologies and also holds a master's degree in physics from Oxford University, which specialized in cosmology and quantum physics. Jude is the author of 7 nonfiction books, currently available 16 languages, 26 countries. Her latest books we have promoted. She is the author of The Cosmic Hologram, Information at the Center of Creation. Jude and I are going to talk a lot about from that book today. And this was the first book Jude has written in a transformation trilogy. This book, Cosmic Hologram, won a Silver Nautilus Award. Her second book of the trilogy is The Story of Gaia. We have also talked to you as the Presence audience about it. And it's already won a Gold Nautilus Book Award. She has, again, been involved in international politics, global and economic and financial systems, has spoken on transformational reforms in the UK, US, Europe, Japan, and South Korea. And I will torture Jude no longer with any more making her listen to her bio. But Jude, thank you so much for taking time today. Love that background.
Thank you, Doug. And as we said before we came on air, it's embarrassing to hear back, isn't it? It's like, did I do that? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well, we will use that background to move into our conversation today. And the conversation today is one that started last week. I did the first episode last week for our audience, and it was based on the article that you and I co-authored along with Dr. Kurt Johnson, Dr. Bob Atkinson. All that information has been put out to Presence, the article, etc. And in the first episode, I introduced that e-publication and specifically gave some background to what is the Holomovement, what are its 2 aspects in terms of its movement, or as some might refer to it, a process, a processor movement. We talked in our first episode, Jude, about the unfolding, the enfolding, which would correlate to an informing, movement or process, and then to which would result in a transforming movement or process. So what we're seeing is that the Holomovement, and why we're so excited about this discussion, in our minds, it's beautifully aligned to our integral approach to theology and the possibilities for so many great things coming in the future that can result in unity, especially the subject of unity. So, I would like to start by asking you to please share your thoughts with regard quickly to the evolutionary leaders movement and the idea of convergence, Jude, because Presence has been involved with that. Our audience is well aware that we're involved with evolutionary leaders, and I've been speaking about the importance of conversion. Could you just give us a few of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, and thanks, Doug. For me, the Evolutionary Leaders Circle, I was invited to join the circle back in 2014. And I said yes, because first of all, I was sensing that what I describe as the evolutionary impulse of our universe as it flows through us was quickening. I felt a quickening coming forward and a potential to serve a shift of consciousness. And that was the initiating intention for the evolutionary circle, evolutionary leader circle, going right back. So what I was interested in is coming together to link up and lift up to serve such potential for human evolution and for healing also. Our material separative approach, our paradigm that's been prevailing for so long. And most, if not all, of the evolutionary leaders came from a holistic perspective, came from, a range of, but essentially unitive perspectives of the nature of reality and of consciousness. So joining together and seeing how we could together serve the good of the whole was something that really I wanted to be part of. And so it has gone forward in that way. And I think what we're seeing now is that everyone has the potential to be an evolutionary leader. All it is actually going within ourselves and answering, it seems to me, the invitation of our universe to evolve. So all of us have this invitation. How we respond to it, of course, is our moments and moments of both personal and collective choice. So this is something that I see growing now, and again, it is part of a convergence. Because for me, my work has been to serve the convergence of leading edge science and the tenets of interspirituality and universal wisdom teachings, indigenous teachings, and all that is happening now. It again, it seems to me, I know we have discussed this and worked together on this, is a convergence. The old paradigm, the old secular paradigm of a materialist and separatist universe, a universe of accident, a universe without meaning and purpose, is literally being turned on its head. So we now are being helped, served, guided, invited to underpin and frame our perception from this unitive awareness, unitive consciousness, and a unitive narrative.
Yeah, that's well said. As a matter of fact, I have quoted a phrase that I think was in Cosmic Hologram, or I saw it somewhere else, but I heard you use the phrase that we can no longer consider the universe a happy accident. And I think that sums it up beautifully as far as a new viewpoint, new paradigms, if you will. You mentioned also just a moment ago this idea of moving away from separation thinking paradigms. And as we look at theology and specifically the movement in the biblical narrative, separation is a metaphor for death in the biblical narrative. And so we know that as that story is told, it stands by the time we get to the end of the way the biblical narrative tells the story, it stands as the last enemy to be defeated. And we're still up against these separation metaphors as we go forth today. And we're going to talk a lot more about the way that separateness happens. But one last thing I'd like for you to share with our audience, because this has been an experience of the presence audience for the last few decades plus, and that is when new evidence arrives, when there is obviously a need for a new paradigm, and a new paradigm is introduced, you can expect to have resistance. And I think in our presence audience, it's easy to tend to think that the only place you really get resistance is in the world of religious interpretations. And that when you think about science, I think most people feel, well, science is just science. Everybody in science thinks the same way. But could you just say a word about what you've experienced with regard to all of the new discoveries in the quantum field, even in the last decade or so, and the new paradigms that have come from that in relation to scientists that are still clinging to previous paradigms, and what you've personally experienced?
It's a really important question, and the easy answer is that no, scientists don't think the same way. I'd like to sort of trace this briefly back to the beginnings of what we know as science,
Yes.
because back in the sort of 15th century, Western Europe was very much dominated by the worldview of the Catholic Church. And that worldview was basically of an unchanging world. And therefore, there was no need to further investigate the world because what was known was known. So anything about the sort of physical nature of reality was actually based on superstition. And clearly, the dominance was there were no more discoveries to be had or should be had. And yet, of course, discoveries were being made because there are a number of awkward people, as there always are wonderfully, that decided that they did want to peer more into the nature of physical reality. They were originally called natural philosophers. Newton was one of those, as was Copernicus and others. But the problem is that there was a perception that they were encroaching on the authority of the church. And so, for example, Galileo was under house arrest for the rest of his life after supporting the sun-centric views of Copernicus. Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake for refusing to recant his views of the cosmos. So it was a dangerous business at the time. And so as a result, the beginnings of a separation took place between the world of the divine and sacred, or certainly the divine as espoused by the church, and the world of the physical realm as pursued by what was to become known as scientists, from the Latin word for scio, for knowing. So that began a process that's ongoing. And those early scientists in the main were actually following a method of exploration that could be replicated, that could be supported and come to a consensus of discovery. But in the main too, they were actually looking to reveal the divine in the manifest world. They weren't seeking to push it away. In the main, they were seeking to bring in a grander perspective of the whole of reality and its divine nature. But of course, over time, because of that initial separation, science became progressively more and more focused just on the physical world. And its proponents became more and more focused on a secular worldview rather than a holistic worldview. So by the time of mid-19th century, which was the sort of the height of this scientific pursuit to that point, it was very much a view of a mechanistic, materialistic world of separation. And that, of course, became the prevailing worldview that drove the Industrial Revolution. So it's a worldview that, despite 170 years or more further scientific exploration, that worldview has prevailed, and it's prevailed with the majority of scientists, as well as in our secular society. At the beginning of the 20th century, that was almost a revolution came forward that gave us clues that really wasn't the underlying nature of reality. The quantum revolution, the revolution of relativity. But all of those philosophical perspectives were shoved to the side. And it was the technologies that they came forward with that became the main focus up till now. But now, which is why I'm so excited, is more discoveries are turning that worldview of separation on its head. And instead, they are revealing what I feel those very earliest natural philosophers intuited, perceived, which is the deeper and unified nature of reality. And that's, I hope, what we're going to continue to explore together.
That's a beautiful background and description, because you're showing the developmental nature of evolution, which is exactly the way the biblical narrative tells the story, is in a developmental manner. And in fact, as you well know, we at Presence have used the model of spiral dynamics now for quite some time, and that's because it's really good as a historical developmental model, and it has indicated, and you can see clearly how that you get a developmental fundamentalism that comes through a traditional lens, if you will. You get a deconstructing faith through an orange lens of modernity. You get then in postmodernity this desire to again move back toward a greater unity, a bigger picture, so forth. And so when you move into the integral frame, uh, which is what we're talking about, once again, it changes the paradigm. And
Yeah.
so, one of the things that the Presence audience, everyone should understand, is that when you're part of new thinking, you are, in that sense, an activist. What I mean by that is, I did an episode, and for people that may not be aware of this that are new to Presence, it's on our website, but I did an episode with Rion Eisler, who is now, talk about activism. Rihanna's in her 90s now, and I envy her energy, actually. But she's done a magnificent job of tracing the issues of the feminine subjugation in world religion and its history. She's done an excellent job of tracing that in her work. And in a conversation we were having, I think offline, I was talking about activism, and everybody thinks in terms of what can I do? What can I do? What kind of activism? And Rion said, well, paradigm shifts are part of a paradigm activism. And I'd never really thought about that term, paradigm activism, but we can all be involved in that. And that is changing, retelling the story based on the new evidences and the things that we are discovering now. So that leads us to the discussion that I really want to focus on a bit here today. And that is the beginning of the story. If you're going to talk about a narrative, it's probably a good idea to start from the beginning. And the universe is the very first thing that's spoken of in the biblical narrative, in the beginning. And of course, you can't have a beginning without the advent of time as a concept. So we have that appearing. We'll talk about that at great length all the way through this series. And that the universe is the very first thing that is manifested from source. And in the biblical narrative, source is called God. In other narratives, it goes by other names. A lot of times, I think the term spirituality is far more palatable to general audiences of people I talk to from different backgrounds and in different age groups, because it doesn't carry the baggage. And also, spirituality is not like carrying the old God narrative of some old man person, if you will. And so spirituality seems to work there. But that initial nature of nature, what is the nature of source? Well, the very first appearance was our universe. Our universe is the first lesson about source.
Mhm.
And that's the way the biblical narrative begins. I used to think, and had grown up hearing, that, yeah, the universe began with the Big Bang. And I think most everybody is familiar with that term. But when I read your book, you explain things in some different terms there. So could we start at the beginning, and could you convey to us language that's more apropos for our universe and its beginnings?
I'll be delighted to. And maybe just to preset that very briefly, talk about Rhiannon and yourself having the conversation about paradigm shifts. And Donella Meadows, a great researcher, looked at how things change, the model of change, processes of change. And she identified increasing importance of what could change, which is all about activism. And she found that the most significant changes come from a paradigm shift. That is the most significant way of effecting change. And as you say, that can be within each and every one of us. We can see the world through a different lens. We can therefore make different choices and decisions and behave differently. That is a paradigm shift. And it seems to me that this is what we're on the threshold of. So yeah, let's go back 13.8 billion years, shall we?
Okay, I like it.
Well, first of all, I say often, our story is the story of our universe. And our universe did begin, the best evidence we have, around 13.8 billion years ago. And you're right, we're taught in school that it began as a Big Bang. And that was a facetious term. That was a derogatory term given by a British cosmologist called Fred Hoyle. Because back in the sort of the 50s, there wasn't an understanding, or there wasn't an agreement, that our universe had a finite beginning. And Fred had a view that it was infinite and eternal, our universe. And so there was a very different perspectives between what was called the steady state folks, such as him, and the folks who were saying, no, no, no. If we go back, we already know that space is expanding over time. So the logic of that takes us back to space getting smaller as we go back into time. And that came to a view that at some point in the past, space would have been as tiny as it could be, but no tinier. And that was the premise of the Big Bang. The view that I take, and it's not a view that I take on opinion, it's a view coming from all the evidence we have, is that instead, yes, our universe began in its tiniest state. But if I ask you, if I say bang to you, what's the sort of connotation of that? If I say bang, it's
Yeah,
chaotic. It's
yeah,
chaotic. It's explosive. That's
right.
not the way our universe came into being. Instead, as in fact the Bible, the biblical tradition says, it came in an incredibly ordered state, an exquisitely fine-tuned state. And as the first moment, not just as a singular event, but the first moment of an ongoing, what I describe as big breath.
Mm.
So as time has flowed from that first moment forward, as space has expanded, our universe has breathed out. And of course, the beauty of this is, first of all, it reflects ancient tradition. The ancient tradition of India, the Vedic tradition, talks about the universe as the breath of Brahman. But also it describes the reality of our universe and its meaning and its purpose and its evolutionary impulse far better than the idea of a Big Bang. It's the same mechanism, it's just we're looking at it again through different lenses. We're seeing it as an incredibly purposeful, meaningful, ordered breath rather than that explosive chaos. So this, I think, is really important, because what it does is I feel it can speak to each of us, because the big breath of our universe breathes through us in every moment. Every breath we take is a tiny reflection of that universal breath of which we're all part. So it actually perhaps helps us to bring the vastness of our universe into the intimacy of each breath that we take. And of course, the breath that we all take together as human beings on our beloved planet.
Absolutely, and that term that shows up in so many narratives, and that brings about an opportunity for discussion globally, and of course that is the present's tagline: a global conversation for a new Earth. That's been our tagline for some time. In that conversation, when you go to the biblical narrative, it talks about human beings being God. And what's interesting, the same word for spirit. And so we already are being introduced to a spirituality, if you will, associated with breath. And that bubbled up in the East, it's bubbled up in the West. And now science, from your perspective, is supporting that kind of advent, if you will, for the nature of our universe. And that it does bring that intimacy and that oneness and connection with source, that we
Absolutely.
ourselves are connected directly with that breath, and that it has a nature. And we'll get into the nature of this universe quite a bit more, obviously, through this whole discussion that we have in this series. But kind of sticking with this, I really enjoyed reading about information as the center of our universe. So much good, again, in your book, which, again, we have the link to that for everybody in our newsletter. Could you, there's a, it's like, where do you start with that conversation? But could you talk to us? It's like the thing of, can you just explain what you think in 25 words or less? Um, what I'm thinking is, what really impressed me was what we know about information all the way down to something called the Planck scale and
Mhm.
its nature. And maybe that might be a place to start, or if you can think of a better
Mhm.
way to begin the conversation, could you please talk to us about information? Because the first part of the unfolding of the universe is directly an informing process.
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, somebody once said I'm obsessed with hyphens because I use throughout my writing information as being meaningful, innately meaningful. So not random data, not just strings of columns of ones and zeros, but innately meaningful information as the foundational stuff of our universe. So if we take a step back, to source, to an infinite and eternal cosmic mind, as Albert Einstein described it, God, Allah, great mystery, the source of all being. The evidence is showing us now that the appearance of our universe arises from deeper levels of non-physical causation, essentially cosmic consciousness. And so in that regard, we can consider our universe as a great thought of God, a great thought of cosmic mind, and a finite thought of an infinite cosmos that began, as we said, 13.8 billion years ago. But then how does cosmic consciousness, how does the source of all being, how does God create the appearance of our universe? And the evidence we now have, and this comes from many, many levels, yeah, we're seeing it at all scales of existence, and we're seeing it through numerous fields of research. But essentially, the cosmic consciousness expresses itself as meaningful information, as digitized information, the same ones and zeros of our telecommunications is the same way in which our universe is manifest from meaningful information in this way that informs all that we call our universe. So its appearance of energy matter, its complementary appearance of space-time, those were the sort of the pillars of 20th century science, but we weren't able to bring them together to explain the wholeness of our universe. When we take a deeper look at a deeper level and reframe them in terms of meaningful information, expressed as quantized energy matter, expressed in a complementary way as space-time, we get the whole story of our universe both as it exists and as it evolves. And so, meaningful information, you mentioned the Planck scale. The Planck scale is like, the pixelation of universal reality. Just as when we look at a hologram or a high definition video, they have pixels where each pixel contains the information that builds up to the whole. The difference is that our universe, the pixelation scale, the size of its pixels, is a trillion times smaller than our best high definition technologies. It's literally as small as to an atom as the atom is to the whole universe. But from that foundational level, cosmic consciousness emerges as the appearance of our universe. And so, the theology, the biblical theology says in the beginning was the word. A word is meaningful. A word is in formation. Indeed, our universe at every scale, from atoms to its wholeness, through planets and plants and people, through to its entirety, is that expression of God's word as meaningful information.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's beautiful. And one of the things also that impressed me was that concept of meaningful information, because once again, for content or information to have a role and function, it obviously must be providing for us meaning.
Exactly.
And if in fact the basis of our universe is built upon information, then it only makes sense that if we, like the universe, are constantly in a developmental mode, we will ourselves go through a history of meaning making. And
Yes.
we will see that in earlier times, the meaning making that was made in the Newtonian world, which I want to talk about and have you weigh in on in just a moment here, was providing meaning. And that meaning was very real, yet it was what we might call true but partial.
Mm-hmm.
And as we have gone through, and I go back to the spiral dynamic model, every worldview in history was an attempt to make meaning
Exactly.
based on what was known at that time. And that's why we say to people, yes, there can be new paradigms in theology. That doesn't mean that people were mistaken per se. It means they did the best they could with what they had and still do at this time. So yeah, I love that meaningful information. And that meaning started in what I guess I would call the Newtonian kind
Mm-hmm.
of world. And then quantum and people like David Bohm blew up that paradigm in front of Mr. Einstein, so to speak, and there was again with a new paradigm being presented by Bohm based on this thing called non-locality, a resistance. Can you talk a little bit about then a Newtonian way of meaning that was meaningful then, and then what happened with non-locality and how those two things now sit in one holistic universe?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And what I would say is that what I'm sharing and what I'm writing about and what the evidence is showing is our universe is intrinsically meaningful, inherently purposeful, whether or not us humans were part of its evolutionary process. It had meaning and is embodied meaning and an evolutionary impulse from the very first moment of the big breath. Yes, that came from, the originating hydrogen and helium to stars and galaxies and black holes, to then interstellar dust clouds and right to the threshold of biological life, and on then to planetary homes and planetary systems and onward to us. So we are individuated, self-aware beings of our essentially sentient living universe. So going back to Newton and then fast forwarding to non-locality, let's cover what 400 years of science, just like that.
Why not?
Absolutely, why not? I mean, sometimes Newton is called the last of the alchemists because probably more than 90% of his writing was about the philosophical expansion of awareness of humanity, the philosopher's stone, the coming from lead to gold. And that wasn't just that wasn't the mundane. It was that journey of awareness, that journey into a perception, an experience of wholeness. That was what he was really interested in. He was also, of course, absolutely brilliant. And one of his great insights is that of gravity. And I went to his home a little while ago, which is still there and is still a centre for science and still has the apple tree. Which, the story goes, he was sitting under and saw an apple drop and had an aha moment. Well, it's still fruiting. And this apple behind me here, this wooden apple, was made by a local artisan who works there. So it always reminds me of Newton.
Wow.
But his great insight was even more extraordinary than realizing just it was the force of gravity that held us and trees to the surface of our planetary home and caused apples to fall, because he extended that to the cosmos. Because what he realized was gravity was also the same force that kept the planets in their orbits around the sun. So he was actually expanding his understanding of reality to encompass what was then, of course, because, nobody really understood how far away the stars were. So they're all parts of, the perceived world. But he extended that understanding of gravity, not just on Earth, but out there, to all that he perceived and could understand as the universe at that point. And of course, he was absolutely right. That then moved forward so much in terms of more and more scientific discoveries, but they were all part of a perception that gradually expanded, but had a view, as he had, of the incredible relationships within the universe. But over time, that sense of divinity, that sense of sacredness was left behind by the scientific methodology. And the universe, as my dear friend Irvin Laszlo said, became disenchanted. And it was seen more and more mechanistic, a beautiful mechanism, but without the divinity that actually underpins and frames and is its reality. So that took us to the end of the 19th century, to an extent that professors in universities were telling potential students, don't study physics. Everything that could be discovered has been discovered. Always dangerous, always dangerous.
Yeah.
And of course, within a few years, discoveries were being made that were beginning to turn that mechanistic view on its head. The discoveries of quantum physics, which showed that indeed we cannot separate an observer from an observed, and that inseparability extends to the whole universe. And that was the one that Einstein really didn't like, because he also understood that within space-time, there is a cosmic speed limit, a universal speed limit, which is the speed of light. So how could you get the whole universe knowing itself in its wholeness simultaneously and at the same time having a speed limit within space-time for any signal? Well, we now understand that it's a both and, that our universe does indeed exist as a non-locally unified entity, to the extent that the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded for research into this, and the Nobel's only given for settled science. So this is no longer contentious. Our universe exists and evolves as a non-locally unified entity. And it does so by projecting its reality, the reality of its appearance of energy and space-time as a hologram, as a cosmic hologram. And that means that within space-time, sure, signals can't go faster than the speed of light. Otherwise, there'd be no flow of time. There'd be no causality within space-time, within the story of our universe. But it's a both and. So that brings us up to now, because even though quantum physics and relativity were giving clues, as I mentioned earlier, the philosophical, the paradigm busting implications of those were so great that they just were getting major pushback. And at the time, because of the Industrial Revolution motoring on with this mechanistic worldview, there was so much invested in the status quo of the paradigm. So instead, the focus was on the technologies that could come from these insights. And now we're on the next revolutionary stage of realizing the wholeness of the world, and that mind and consciousness aren't what we have. They're literally what we and the whole world are. And we're doing so at a time that really is urgent, that we do wake up to remember we're inseparable. So this is far more than a revolution in science, because we're finding this reality playing out through every scale of our universe's existence and evolution, and us. We're seeing the same patterns underpinning, vast clusters of galaxies and planetary systems and clouds and climate, but they also are the same patterns that underpin ecosystems and collective human behaviors. We are intrinsically inseparable from this whole wonder of our universe's story, and therefore a unitive narrative to underpin and frame what can support us in seeing through this lens of unity and acting differently as a result.
Beautiful, beautiful. I'm listening to that description of what, again, I think we would all agree on as source.
Yes.
In that sense, you do have a realm of diversity of forms or things called universe. And we have in our biblical trajectory shown or proposed that the initial understandings of God came through forms. And the problem is that form really is an indication of role and function as opposed to source.
Yeah.
Source is where identity is found. Our source, who's your parent? What source is that which provides your identity? And so, in that sense, form exists as an absolute reality, but its role and function is simply that for the diversity that was manifested from the source, but the source itself, that which is headed toward that non-local, if you will, that direction toward this unified source from which everything comes, is formless. And the importance of that theologically is that word separation.
Yeah.
And what we get to is, what is the nature of the universe? What is the nature of our global human family? And when you get into the interpretation of content, narratives, etc., that has an outcome of separation, of other, of those that are, in some theological circles, more fundamentalists might say, saved and lost, and these kinds of paradigms. That's when you really have an identity crisis. And so, again, it's happened in nationalistic, racial, gender, in all these segments. And it only stands to reason that the nature of our universe is telling us as a story how our narratives, theologically or otherwise, should have outcomes that mirror that same wholeness that you were just talking about.
Absolutely. And unity isn't about uniformity. What we
Right.
see in our universe is the whole journey, its evolutionary journey from that first moment of this of its ongoing big breath has been from simplicity to ever greater levels of complexity and individuated self-awareness and its interdependence being realized and perceived. So, and I talk about a living universe and a loving universe, because for me, the deepest foundations of love are all inclusive. They're all inclusive. They're relational. And literally what the evidence is revealing is that we truly are inseparable from the wholeness of our universe, and it's and embody within us its evolutionary impulse and its big breath in every moment, but also that we're invited to literally, now it seems to me, wake up to remember that we're inseparable, that the unity, its wholeness, is expressed in radical diversity. Each of us is unique. Every tree, every leaf on every tree, every snowflake is unique. That incredible radical diversity. And yet we're all part of that wholeness, that oneness, that unity. And when we do wake up to remember that, it seems to me that we're being invited to literally consciously evolve. You talked, Doug, about, the integral perspectives and the stages of evolutionary perception. I do feel we're on the threshold of the most important, profound leap in human consciousness that there has ever been. And we're able to do it collectively, not just as nations or as groups of folks or as, and everybody's path is wondrous and to be honored and respected. But all those paths are literally up this same mountain.
Yeah, and so thinking about that direction, and then thinking about the fact that um, everything is centered upon this information and this informing process that starts this unfolding of our
Yeah.
universe. I've read a number of articles that are out there that talk about that we as human beings are just energy. We are vibrations. We are again, it's moving back toward the formless, if you will. Someone might ask the question, well, what does information have to do with energy? Can you share with us some of the quantum discoveries
Yeah.
that bring about more information about that relationship between information and energy?
Well, energy is equivalent to matter, which is what the quantum physicists discovered. So we have energy matter, quantized energy matter, and we also have space time. And again, the relativity of space, the relativity of time. Einstein's genius, in my view, wasn't just realizing that space is relative to an observer and time is, but they have to come together if we can have a universal story at all as invariant space-time. So we have these two pillars of 20th century science: quantized energy matter and space-time. And they don't seem to connect. And yet we have a universe that is clearly wholly connected. If so, that has in the past been indicative of the need to go deeper. So for example, if we went to the 19th century, if we look at phenomena of electricity, they seem to be very different from phenomena associated with magnetism. But it took the genius of Maxwell to say, actually, they're different perspectives of the same force. Yeah? Electromagnetism, which drives our modern world. The same thing is now happening to the understanding of energy, matter, and space-time, that we need to go deeper. We need to see that they are complementary aspects of a deeper reality. And that deeper reality is information, meaningful information that is expressed in different ways, in complementary ways, as quantized energy matter. So when you say we're energy matter, we're actually meaningful microcosms of a conscious universe. We are microcosmic co-creators. Therefore, we are innately conscious, as our universe is innately conscious. Consciousness, whether it's flowing through us or the whole universe, is expressed, articulated as meaningful information, which is then manifested as the appearance of energy and matter. And the beauty of that appearance is that, yes, indeed, because energy and matter is quantized, it means that it's like notes of music. It's not emergent, it's not a gloop, it's not a grey gloop. It's like notes of music, which can be expressed in very specific ways that then can dance together. So that is the beauty of the way consciousness expresses itself in our universe. And the other thing is, because of that, it's also frequency, it's vibration, it's wavelength. We could go on for a very long time talking about resonance and coherence, but the nature of quantized energy and matter enables all of that to happen at all scales of existence throughout our universe. And so those patterns, those informational patterns, can scale up and scale down, from atoms to people to planets to galaxies to the whole of our space-time of our universe. So this is why it's important that we need to go deeper and understand that the stuff of reality is meaningful information expressed in complementary ways as energy matter, bodily, but also space-time, because energy matter doesn't have any notion of time. If you talk to a quantum physicist about time, they will, in the main, which is why we need both, because energy matter enables our universe to exist, but it's the flow of time and the expansion of space that enables it to evolve. That's why you need those both pillars, but you need to go deeper to understand that they're both emerge as different expressions of meaningful information.
Yes, and for those that are listening and following this, as we go along in this series, we will be tracing the historical developmental path of the understanding of these things, all the way back to these ideas of God being understood through form. This is why, in the very beginning, when you read the biblical narrative, you'll see that one of the primary problems that people had was idolatry. And idolatry was this identification with a form as, in and of itself, a sacred or divine thing. This was a great problem for the early days of Israel. And people acquainted with the biblical narrative, etc., are well aware of that. Then it moves on developmentally to where God is understood as dwelling in a temple, and specifically within a specific space within that temple. And so God is in a space that's limited or quantified, if you will. But you will have then in the story people like Solomon, all the way to the martyr Stephen in the first century CE, who were saying, but God doesn't dwell in buildings made with hands, meaning within quantized forms. And Jesus is going quantum when he says, the domain of God, the kingdom, is not as you understood it, as a Davidic kingdom with all the kings that preceded, but rather it's within. And now we're moving in toward that more and more formless understanding of the source and of the truth of that identity. So for you that are listening to this and watching this from the present standpoint, are saying, what is all of this going to have to do with the biblical narrative? Believe me, as we go along, that will be what we look at, because it brings a whole new perspective to the same story. And so the content, again, is what we'll be looking at, and a lot of things will start jumping off the page that perhaps didn't jump off the page. That's been my experience. So that is why this study has been so important. One thing I'd like to also say, Jude, as we close here, you've done a great job of helping us with this informing, with the breath concept finely tuned from the very beginning the obvious evidences of consciousness as the nature of our universe, all the way down to the human level in our lives. But one of the things that the evolutionary leaders did was to come up with something called a unitive narrative.
Mhm.
And we're talking about the biblical narrative. And I can't remember, but I know that I read certain parts of that that I'm pretty sure were came from input that you had in that. So can you just give us a little bit of a feel for that unitive narrative so
Mhm.
people can understand the efforts that many diverse groups of leaders are coming to in the name of a unitive narrative?
Be delighted to, Doug, because it felt very guided and timely that a call came from a circle that I was involved with that was actually related to the United Nations SDGs. And the view was that the SDGs themselves, while absolutely a way forward, were very siloed of themselves. They weren't coming from a unitive perspective of wholeness. And therefore, there were about 140, 150 people, not all of whom were part of the Evolutionary Leaders Circle, but some of us, quite a lot of us are, that came together. And the call was, we need a new narrative. We have a narrative of separation. And we need a new narrative. And one of the folks there, Rick Cluxton, pointed us in terms of what Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, the great storyteller, had spoken to when he said the only narrative for the 21st century is one that is based on unity. Unity of humanity, unity of our planetary home, unity of our whole universe and beyond. And so we came together as a small group of us, but obviously in great consultation, to come up with a text of such a unitive narrative that basically was an inner and outer, brought together. You mentioned Rianne Eisler earlier, the masculine, the feminine expressions, very much honoured and respected all faith-based traditions, the tenets of interspirituality, indigenous teachings, universal wisdom teachings, and was essentially founded on this evidence, this new science of wholeness. And it's quite short. The actual unitive narrative text itself is around 700 words. We wrote a context to it and a call to action from it. But it is that distillation of what we're now discovering at this next stage in our journey of discovery as what it may mean to be human, as well as what it may mean to be divine, and the both and of that. And so, yes, if you'd like to share that with the presence community, that would be great, because we're now using it to underpin and frame transformational change in the world, both at the United Nations level, through unitive education, through unitive economics, through unitive governance, through unitive justice, because all of those are all part of the holistic move forward, but they can all be framed, but they're all being seen through this lens of wholeness.
Yes, and again, we'll be talking about this as we go along toward the end of the narrative. We end up with this phrase "new earth," new heaven and earth.
Yes.
That's very much a part of what's talked about in evolutionary leaders, this arising of a new earth based on this unitive narrative. And in the biblical narrative, the result of this new heaven and earth is that you have a new Jerusalem, which stands as a metaphor of that which transcends the previous explicative form of an actual physical city. This now becomes a metaphor for a universal place of transcendence where
Yes.
race is transcended and culture and gender and class and on we go. And the narrative closes by saying that all nations walk in the light of it. And so the outcome again of a narrative should be pointing to what everyone is seeking, and that is some type of unitive narrative. Why? Because that is the nature of nature, and it's our nature, and actually that which will be most rewarding and most abundant on our planet and for our global family. So, a lot more to talk about here. I'm going to be greedy enough to ask Jude to join us later in the series when we talk about enfolding and transforming and get a little bit more into her most current book, The Story of Gaia. So we will be asking Jude back. But Jude, thanks so much for sharing with us this oh so important information. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. And I'm delighted that you're greedy. I love to come back.
Great. Then it's a date. We'll set that up with everybody, and we'll continue on with the series next week. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build on this conversation of form and the unfolding and the informing process, and we'll take it from there. Eventually, we're going to get our good friend Dr. Kurt Johnson on here as well, and some other good folks. So until then, we will see everybody next time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Doug.